stories are likely to succeed, and then we are going to do why more good equality representation is likely to happen if that it becomes factual, and why contemporary is an important thing. Firstly, about why these stories are likely to going to succeed. The premise here is that we are going to say that there could be high probability of success even if the alternative becomes factual, just meaning that the negative can't just say that this is going to be almost like no one's going to fund it, etc. The first thing here is that I think like demography which can be captured is kind of going to be like minority communities and going to be large, because I think it's really easy for like the minority communities to be like motivated to go to like see the movies or see these kind of videos by saying that this movie is something that is unique and represents you uniquely. The demands are likely to be high because this is something new and hasn't happened like within like the history of like the film, for example, meaning that it's really easy for them to like advertise and gain attention for this. I think this is a blue ocean in a way. The second thing here is that we are going to say that there is capacity for higher minority background people, simply because I think in the past, I think regardless of this, minority background people have been hugely related in terms of economically and socially, meaning that there are people who are attending like film schools, who are attending like, those companies, for example, and then we can hire these kind of bunch of rounds of like people who represent these kind of minority people in order to create movies on art counterfactual. Then onto constructives, why representation is going to happen more on an accurate manner on art counterfactual. What we mean by accurate, it means like diverse from like, for example, having like, casting like minority people to like small like things, for example, like the use of languages, which is oftentimes contains a lot of nuance, to use it in like the correct manner, or like, for example, things like how they are dressed, how like, how they behave in like public settings, etc. These are really small but important details which are going to represent like the minority communities. I think this is going to be far more on the affirmative counterfactual. The way in which we are likely to do this is that I think within the creation of this movie, it is more likely that we are going to hire vastly like majority amount of the minority people. For example, like from cast like directors to like staff on the ground, etc. These are likely to be like minority people, and more engagements are going to be done in terms of how to depict like the minority people. Why is this the case? The first thing here is that obviously like the scope of like the audience of the movies are likely to be minorities, because that's like the hugest people that we can like monetize on, meaning that we don't really want to piss off them. On the negative counterfactual, because this is like a traditional like story, they can like mobilize other like people from the majority backgrounds by saying that this is like nostalgic, etc. Meaning that even if they do piss off like minority backgrounds in the negative counterfactual, it's not going to be detrimental. I think on our counterfactual, because it is detrimental, there's more incentive to care. The second thing here is to say that because we are going to make like a story from scratch, means that there is more room for consideration and more like conversations to happen. I think it is going to be more rationalized to spend more money in terms of like engaging with like these kind of small nuances, because they fear of like misrepresentation, and also because like the majority of the people are likely to be in minority communities and they seem to be like misrepresented. This is not going to happen on the negative counterfactual, simply because I think they have like catered to nostalgia to be able to like succeed, meaning that there's less spaces for them to engage in discussions, or maybe like spending a lot of money in terms of hiring like minorities to discuss can be like the things that they can cut up, as opposed to like flashy things, for example, having like really good like costumes, for example. So I think the implication here is to say that I think like on our counterfactual is the counterfactual which are going to have more capacity and incentive to care for these kind of minority backgrounds and the depiction of this. Impact here is pretty simple. I think there's going to be more accurate depictions which depict like these kind of minorities in a better manner. Why is this important? The first thing here is that I think this is mostly important in terms of like perception from like the majority, right? Because I think majorities are likely to engage in these kind of movies maybe by going to watching them, or by simply like looking at like YouTube clips or like reels, for example. I think these kind of like media is a really strong thing which creates like the perception of the minorities, because maybe like those kind of people don't have like much interaction with like the minorities, or because like media and films are like catchy and noticeable compared to maybe everyday conversations, right? So I think like by just like having like an inaccurate depiction and seeing the clip in and of itself, it can be something which is powerful, which is going to shape maybe their perception of like the minority communities. This looks like, for example, from like if it's like big example, it looks like Hamilton, where they like hired like the founding fathers as black men, although they had like connections towards slavery. This I think like cognitively disconnects like these kind of founding fathers from like slavery in and of itself. I think like smaller details includes for example, Asians being depicted as being good at maths when majority of us are not, or like misuse of Chinese dialect, or like Ryosei dialect, or like Kansai dialect within like Japanese movies, which creates like a perception that like all Kansai people are funny when we're not. So I think like the thing here is that these kind of media is really like powerful in order to shape like majority perception, and majority perception is that these kind of movies create are something which like minorities can have like cognitive dissonance or have like significant amount of agony, I guess. So I do think like these kind of media is powerful, and I do think like accurate depiction is not is important in that sense. Then why is this important then for minority communities? I think this is pretty straightforward. As I said before, I think this creates how like they interact with majorities. But even if you don't take that, I think independently they are likely to feel betrayed by like big companies, or like they're likely to feel betrayed because they have the expectation that they are being represented. For example, like being in Abiyo movie, for example, that they weren't, as depicted as being like good or whatever, they're likely to feel betrayed. They're not likely to engage in minority movies in the future because they fear that they might be betrayed the next time too. So I think they're less likely to seek for opportunities, even if maybe there is good depiction on the negative counterfactual, and they're able to prove that the quality is going to be better. I think the bar of engaging within these kind of movies are likely to be higher once this representation happens. Thus, I think it is significantly important to have accurate representation. Affirmative.
With that first ask for verified speech, now let's move on to first next. Please here.
We accept the trade-off that this might be less in the number or slightly half in this context or not specifically tailored story, but we say that we believe that we are able to give the larger impact to the community, we are able to reach out to the majority of the people, and I think these are very important impacts compared to what Affirmative side tried to argue. We challenge whether or not this minority, new story will be accepted. We will argue that these, the expansion of the current story is likely to reach to the people more and will be accepted more. First thing that I prove in my speech is that why is expansion likely to done well. Obviously, I think the creator of this story are not stupid. They are likely to care about how the quality of the movie looks like, because I think the quality of the movie also leads to they obviously want to avoid criticism to get this movie is bad, stuff like that. I think that this also ties to the director, how they're likely to view, what kind of movie they are likely to make. That's the reason why I think directors have the massive incentive to care about reputation, that they are likely to avoid making stupid things. This looks like, for example, asking for the advice to make it authentic, or for example, choosing a character which is not based on the identity of for example, based on the identity of the base or stuff like that. I think this is a likely scenario that will happen in our product, and we are able to prevent the worst type of misrepresentation happening in our product. Then, the second thing that I prove in my speech is that why we can be able to get more attention in our product compared to them. I think that in our product, we are able to, the our product will make the sound expansion or recasting of the movie. And I think this leads to more attention in our product. First reason why is that the story is more relatable to the majority of people, which drives attention more from the international community. For example, Disney story or fairy tale stuff like that. I think that the reason why white people are able to, or majority of people are able to relate to this story is because they are likely to feel nostalgia, and we are able to characterize the feeling of nostalgia in our present, because these are the stories that people are familiar with. That's the reason why I think there is more chance of exposure for the majority of people to know, and relate to the story that they have. We are able to weaponize the pre-existing popularity. The second reason why we are able to get more attention is because we are using media channel that white people is also watching, but they are able to discover the actors, they are able to discover the representation of the minority community. I think these are the likely scenario that we are able to weaponize media channel that white people is watching. How the comparative looks like? I think the comparative with new story is likely to looks like, for example, highlighting their limited experience with getting injustices, or for example, having a historical fight. I think these scenarios are likely to happen in order to have a historical representation, in order to have properly narrative. I think these are the scenarios that likely to happen in their side of paradigm. Then, the That's it.
We thank first the neck for verifying speech. Now let's move on. Invite second act.
Alright, is this all good? Okay. One clarification before I talk about two things in my speech. First, why their alternative isn't really going to turn out that well, either in general, because it won't be that popular, and second, it won't have any meaning. Secondly, why our side will create movies that not only do well, but are going to be highly acceptable. One clarification, they talk about how movies on our side will make people uncomfortable. We're not sure why this is likely the counterfactual on our side. We're not just going to create a movie where someone from an underrepresented community just goes on a Grand Theft Auto spree, just kills everyone that is from the majority. That's not the movies we're creating. We're envisioning movies like Sinners. We're envisioning movies like Get Out. We're envisioning movies like Everything Everywhere All at Once, where it's stories not specifically about only our grievances, but stories that people in general can relate to, that simply cast people from the underrepresented community. So that's out of the debate. That being said, let's engage with their main issue. Three things. First, they say that it'll get popularity broadly because people can relate. 4 reasons why this is not true. First, on their side, their movies, when they recast or slightly tweak a movie, it's just going to feel like a cash grab. It's just going to feel like an EI project that is created by Disney to create more audiences. People are not really into this. Second, the story of the plot is literally already known. You already know what's happening. You don't get afraid of spoilers because you already know what's going to happen to Ariel. You already know what's going to happen anyway, so it's literally no interest. Thirdly, there's always a higher likelihood of right-wing media calling it unearned because they feel like this movie was created and already successful, and you're only attaching your name to it rather than working hard and making sure you create a good script. And fourthly, we say critics on their side, not even being racist, we'll call it uninspired because it's not creating anything new, no new angles, no new stories, nothing great about it. That's why it's not going to be that popular. You can see how Disney remakes were somewhat successful early on, but as they go along, especially when they started recasting, they lost a lot of steam. Secondly, they talk about how it's still good because the directors want to maintain their reputation. Firstly, it's still unlikely for them to make a real meaningful twist or expansion to the story because there's nostalgia that they want to go into. You recast and you remake specifically to gain the same audience over and over again, so you're likely to rely on nostalgia rather than a meaningful expansion. Secondly, they're going to be risk averse because it's likely a remake of a big franchise, so it's going to be expensive, you won't expand that much, you don't get meaningful exploration of new stories. Thirdly, they say you at least discover this new actor, not likely once again. Either number one, you are not likely to be credited for the success of the movie. Who gets credited is Disney. Who gets credited is the original story and the production. Secondly, who gets credited are the past creators of that story. So you will remember the voice of James Earl Jones in the old Lion King. You don't care that they created it in the new one. This is what happens with a lot of new movies. This is what happened with John Wick. They changed it and focused on Ballerina, the new girl in the last movie, movie bomb. Same thing with Mad Max. They made it with Furiosa, movie bomb. Because they don't care about the new story, they see it as a cash grab. The conclusion being, number one, it's not really that intuitive that these movies get that popular to begin with. Just look at empirical facts. Secondly, you're not really going to get any exploration either into a new story, expansion of the story, or the artists themselves. Thirdly, this will not trickle down to other opportunities. You will be pigeonholed to only create remakes rather than being trusted to take the responsibility of a new franchise. Speaking of new franchises that are material, they question why on our side will it be popular. We say, number one, if it's good enough, people will watch it. Or number two, if it garners a new audience, people will watch it. Firstly, I think for a lot of material from First Affirmative stands on our capability. The growth of the underrepresented community, how they're present in a lot of art films, our schools, they have a lot of scholarships that have been passed down and inherited from past successful minority artists. We say this allows them high capability, which means they can make great movies. Second, we say that on our side, it is still the best interest of the corporations to make sure they're successful. I hear this argument 3 rounds in a row today, that it's really the best interest of whoever's funding it, so I think it applies here. So we say on our side, we still get access to production budget, so the movies are good. You still get marketing budget, so it will be popular. You get facilities, VFX artists, and all of that to make sure the movie is going to be good. Thirdly, we're not going to make super foreign movies either. Once again, we're using general good plot with minority or underrepresented cast members, as I've been mentioned before. But when does the audience have a real interest into this? Because the audience wants something new, and audience including all of us here. Number one, we're bored of what Netflix puts out, because they make low-budget movies, and so we want something high-budget from the minority groups. Second, we're bored of YouTube shows that are just brain rot and just watching for the next episode of Fruit Love Island. Thirdly, the algorithm has fed us a lot of bias, so we are feeling saturated. That's why they want something new. Which means on our side, the new cast is an interesting take on the new underrepresented community is an interesting take on making a new movie. Second, the woke crowd obviously will help us out, so that will add our money as well. Thirdly, we're following momentum. There's already past success with Sinners and all these other groups and movies that makes it worth it. The impact you get on our side, financial success, awards that you get, because you're quote-unquote being bold, even though you're just casting someone who isn't the same skin color as the previous movies, you still get critic representation from that. Second, a cultural shift where Hollywood sees that Ryan Coogler gambled on Sinners and he won. Now there will be more movies in our future. Lastly, we inspire the next generation. On our side, what we simply want is to stop all of this Disney recasting slot. What we want is absolute cinema for all those reasons around.
With that second act of our funny speech, now let's move on to the second act.
No matter how accurate and nuanced the work of Affirmative will be, whether or not those stories reach to the world is the only important condition for our communities. Because anyway, we have our own vernacular folk stories, folk tales, songs that represent our culture, everyday life, domestically or internally. But we, our Japanese, for instance, just like domestically inheriting these good stories for the old days. If the rest of the world don't give a shit about these stories, we don't call that as a representation. We think the condition of being represented as a culture or the one the human being in this world is those stories giving some impact, even if it will trigger some harmful fetishization of our culture or harmful reaction from these people. Even if the random tourists from US thinks that we still ride horses in Japan, we still have samurais going around, which is wrong. We would prefer that more than dying in the silence and no one really cares about our culture. First thing in my speech about the principle, in the absolute worst case of the other side, which is about we have a lot of backlash, hate, racism triggered by these, just stealing these, the plot and just recasting them, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding this topic. But our view is we should promote this compost to the people. We should invade and appropriate their stories because that is what we've been stolen and defied for the century. But the first justification, which is the reparation, the true value of the POC being represented will be maximized when we are successfully mirroring our pain and suffering to these people. You know that there is a memes of in a white actor in a horror movie just saying the Japanese line of him with a bunch of nonsense like a Toyota, sushi, we want the reverse to your people, and I think that is kind of irregular. Secondly, the controversy and the newly emerged debate and discussion in itself is a symbolic value that we need to claim more than just keeping these types of contents to be highly nuanced, highly contextual, highly inaccessible for the rest of the world. We rather prefer, even at the risk of the misrepresentation, we want to pause that conversation with the random people living in Texas. We want to pause that conversation across the world, no matter how much it will be unpopular for the non-POC community, that we want to be gaining more attention, gain more, drive more discourses through throughout the whole process of creation and appropriating the stories from that we haven't really created from the beginning. This principal issue is the most important way material, even if we can see the absolute worst case scenario on our side of the house, and we do not get any positive reactions from the rest of the world, we still stand for that occasion. Then, I'd like to talk about the accuracy push that they talk about. Their main push is about, like, this is going to be highly contextual, nuanced, accurate. But if they choose the nuance and context, but with those contexts frequently appears on your algorithm, on your social media, and on your regular daily, media channel on a daily basis, that they need to bear some trade-off with the accuracy and nuance. They need to simplify the story to be understood to some extent. Even if you are to include some local nuance, you need to just prioritize. That project itself can be gained at sufficient level of attention, therefore their media company, for instance, or that process of the creation of the project will go on sustainably. They seem to also agree with this fact that they said that we're going to use general plot to just discuss, to cover these types of minority suffering. But the question here is why this general new plot will be seen more than compared to a fairy tale that everyone in this world knows, or the Hollywood movie that becomes so much controversial for just using a POC actor for a main character. And I don't think in terms of the degree of the coverage in terms of exposure, they don't have an advantage here. And as we already highlighted, even if they have best story in the world to address the suffering of our people, if that doesn't reach the people outside of the world, the rest of the world, that doesn't have any value. The final thing in my speech is about the POC writers, actors, directors that will be bring their places, create their places in the industry. If we primarily focus on remaking the stories, this triggers the influx of the people from POC communities to take the positions in the entertainment, film, publishing industries. Why is this the case? Firstly, simply because, uniquely on our side, we need exclusive positions for these people in the industry that we use these media channels like Hollywood, the film industries that dominated by white people, that we use that channel as well. Second, there is an inherent value on authenticity that even if these people are conservative, but they're still wants to out-compete other version of the stories that talks about and cover these types of minority issues. Then, thirdly, a few initial entries that even if we have some a little number of people getting into this industry can build the connection and relevance within these industries. One person gets evaluated or recognized within by other producers, for instance, that can that person can recommend other POC people to be in the next project or get involved in the other the merchants or project. This interpersonal connection is something very crucial and very especially in these industries. Why this is our debate winning? Firstly, because these expand our spaces in those industries, they can put food on the table. Second, this is symbolic, this is very important. We create unique spaces within a predominantly dominated by a non-POC community that we expand these job prospect career in the society itself is an inherent value that we are going to claim. Thank you.
We thank second Nick for a very fine speech. Now let's move on to the third app.
Sorry, I'm just finding the results. Two questions. First, what is better for audiences? And secondly, how does this impact all levels of production? So first on audiences, and I guess there's two subclasses here. First on representation and then on entertainment. So on representation, the great claim from Affirmative is that there's no point in having accurate representation if no one's going to watch it. And they actually get like attention because POC actors and minorities and all that kind of thing. And that's actually a net positive. But I think the problem is they don't do the work to show that these representations actually result in a positive perception of these minorities. Because in many instances, there is just like sort of like a reactionary tendency to these movies in that they try to make these minorities assimilate to the majoritarian identity. And so what happens is audiences then think, yeah, we all share like the exact same mannerisms, we like the exact same things, they're just like me. And then when they meet a minority from that community that behaves differently from people in these superhero movies, that behaves differently from them, they're disappointed, they think that they are simply less than them, and they hold them to a standard that has been set for them by this movie that is kind of like misleading about what these people are truly like. And that is obviously a net harm to these communities. Even if you get non-entire classes from like seeing yourself portrayed as a superhero, seeing yourself portrayed as Spider-Man. What do we have on our side? They say that sometimes, in some instances, these movies might be less watched, that like the majoritarian culture will not consume to the same extent. But we don't think this is necessarily a harm. In many instances, minorities have spaces where they're able to celebrate these authentic depictions of their own cultures. And this is something that actually results in community being built between members of that community, which necessarily means that they're able to withstand all of the pressures that come from existing in a racist society or homophobic society or sexist society, because they at least know they have solidarity in each other, that they recognize the most authentic version of the person right next to them, and that is what is most important to these people. But beyond that, I do just think they're incredibly uncharitable about whether people would be open-minded towards these depictions or not, because I think there is just a massive entertainment value in these movies. We gave the example of Sinners. They say people don't want to consume stories about your suffering, but in many instances they actually are quite interested. This was a quite successful movie that had a major subplot that was about the KKK, where all the characters end up dying because they're black, and for no other reason than them being sad. But it still was a massive hit because there was massive catharsis within that depiction that allowed for celebration of things that were born out of that painful experience of Black Americans, such like blues music and all the other amazing cultural adventures that they actually gave birth to as a consequence of their suffering. And so I think it's just inaccurate that these are not entertained, that people are not interested. And I think there's ways that they end up spreading, through word of mouth, through the fact that people see a scene that they've just never seen in a movie before, they repost it to Twitter. People are interested, they go see the movie, that's how it spreads, that's how people actually see these people for who they are and begin accepting them. On their side, even if you do get maybe more attention towards it, it's unclear that it is positive attention, because we explain to you that people less likely to feel nostalgic over time. By the time you're getting to the fifth Spider-Man movie, you don't care at all. You don't care that the person is black, you don't see them any differently, you don't see any black people any differently as a consequence of that. But beyond that, it's just the politicization of these stories. It is the politicization, the backlash, the anger that majoritarian groups feel is a form of reparations. But it's not, because it's not really something that hits them internally. It's just some hatred that these few out minorities for actually stepping into these into these positions in ways that end up hurting the minority more than they hurt the person from the majoritarian group. So how can it be reparative in nature if because a black person is cast as Juliet in a Broadway show, she received infinite hatred and none of her cast members supported her. That is not a form of reparation. It's just continually traumatizing these people and exposing them to insane amount of backlash. And so I think that is something that we cannot stand for. Beyond that, I think even if we take the worst version of our case, where it is a story about suffering, the average person or the average majoritarian person has never had any experience or therefore not inherently relate to the story that's happening, I think they can still relate to the qualities that the characters in these movies exhibit. They can still relate to courage, empathy, joy, common human feelings that we all feel that person also experiences, and they tie them to their own experiences as well. And so I think we still get stories that people can relate to, but they're also authentic to that community, and they can be celebrated within that community and outside of that community. That's why we win this debate. Lastly, in terms of impact on all production levels, to the extent we believe this is entertaining, to the extent we believe it's authentic and all those things, I I think it's more likely to actually get recognition from places like Oscars and like actually get awareness towards this community and things like that. And I think that ends up being really important because it's what results in like more people from minority backgrounds being hired across all aspects of production. That's actually what allows them to like gain an income from this, like just having enjoyment and things like that. But I also think it's something that also allows them to stand aside the majoritarian group in that society because it recognizes the same institutions. When it comes to their franchises, in many instances, people don't want to take them as serious art. They're just frivolous things that exist for entertainment, which necessarily means that like the work that is put into them by like these minority actors in many instances is never recognized. They're not gonna get like Black Panther 3 winning like I don't know a couple of Oscars for acting, no matter how acceptable the performances are. But it's seen as like the most nominated movie in like Oscar history, and that was important. For all of those reasons, we propose. Thank you.
We thank the F for a very fine speech. Now let's move on to the last speaker, third minute, sorry.
Before I start, I want to say sorry to anybody that I didn't get a sticker to my laptop.
No worries. It's granted.
There are two questions I want to answer in today's debate. The first is that which side is more feasible in producing these stories, these proves that these stories will succeed in being pushed to the mass public in the first place. The second, oh my god, my laptop's going, sorry. The second is which side is in the best interest of POCs, and this proves the most vulnerable protected under our side of the house. So let's then move on then to what is the first question I want to answer. So the first question is, Chisato tries to fool you into believing that these news stories will be appealing to the larger industry, for example, the film industry or the publishing industry, etc. Here's why they won't. Firstly, Hinano already figures out to you what are the incentives of these publishing and entertainment industries and how they're likely to be risk averse of backlash, and therefore they're going to be cautious in the ways that they make these newer stories, along with how these publishers will not have the knowledge of new or lived experiences that ensures that these stories are going to be accurate, means that they are very likely to be varied in what kind of stories will be told and have a higher barrier of these newer stories to be approved in the get-go. Rather, they are much more likely to care about existing stories that are much more easier to adapt or easier to edit. So even if you buy that these industries will care, the way that they care is not as compassionate as Chisato frames for a few following reasons. Firstly, what they likely to do is to make stories that are much more easier or cost-effective to publish, to widen their profit margins, to compensate for the smaller consumer demographic as per the characterization coming from Affirmative. This means that you're likely going to prioritize more simpler, newer stories that are modernized than compared to complex and historically accurate stories that require more resources to ascertain their accuracy. For example, hiring historical checkers on film set or fact-checking their scripts. Exactly like what Batara gives as examples. This looks like adapting Crazy Rich Asians or Everything Everywhere all at once. There's lesser cultural or historical ties to the character storyline, or like Sinners, which intertwine with fantasy elements to make them more appealing and giving up production on the Moon Goddess book series that are deeply intertwined with the cultural mythology of Asians. Even if accuracy is slightly emphasized, it is far more likely to be misrepresented as per what Hinano said, based on all of the reasons I gave you above. Secondly, let's talk about the comparative on our side. What's likely to happen is that recasting or expanding stories are much more easier to pass production lines and acceptance of wider audiences. This directly responds to Batara's claims on lesser audience buying. These stories are likely to be chosen for remakes or expansion are probably stories that are popular as per what Ryosei has told you. One, they're probably solid the foundation to spell out these characters even if their reception is somewhat subpar. Two, it is much more palatable to the wider audience to get more support and less backlash. And thirdly, they need to ensure that both international and people of color audiences are able to accept and support the release of these films, right? From the international community, they probably prioritize stories that have a larger relatability or nostalgia to appease to their cases, or for the POC communities, they're likely going to ensure that recasting or expansion will be one that allows them to feel like they are seen and fully integrated into the storyline to get more senses of belonging. Especially if the demographics are existing fans, expanding these stories creates more excitement and more content for the fans to explore, as to what Ryosei has told you. For example, larger world building means that there's more capacity for you to introduce people of color characters that fit into the wider storyline. Exactly with the example from Alexis, POC Spider-Man only existed because the story was able to expand and introduce people of color culture to the larger international audience that sparks more discourse on how these characters are represented or representations of their POC to communities of people of color than compared to their desires for far more representation and opportunities that will help to get better lives at the end of the day. Which is the second question I'm going to answer to this debate, which is which side is in the best interest of POCs and therefore proves that the most vulnerable is protected. We want to make a very clear thing here, which is that we can see, maybe on our worst case, there are lesser stories that will be remade due to the limited amount of fulfilled criteria to avoid these backlash. But a handful of these stories are going to be far more impactful than compared to the larger amount of new stories but way lesser in impact, right? For two particular reasons. Firstly, onto the principle of what these kinds of POC want in autonomy and representation. This is far more important than compared to the principle of accuracy, and this is the only way for them to allow them to reclaim back their stories. We think that the best form of protection for these stories is to ensure that their stories and lived experiences or their history do not get diluted over misrepresentation or the lack of accuracy or using fantasy elements just to expand their storylines and take away that what's most important to them, which is their lived experiences, and therefore these films will not be as relatable as to what the negative side wants to claim on the dark side of the house for the people of color community. Secondly, these opportunities for them to be able to reclaim their stories can only be available when you have a rising platform of discourse. This is why we want to flesh out for you why even in our worst case scenario where we have negative discourse or more backlash, it's still going to be good for the people of color, because this is where people of color can go into the subreddit and talk to the international community about what should set precedent, about how you should make these storylines more accurate for these kind of characters, or how can you make these characters much more relatable or representative of these cultures, right? So third, lastly, on practical impact, we think that there's more integration for the people of color. This is where I want to put Alexis exactly that in the fifth Spider-Man movie that Black Spider is normalized. This also means society does not see these characters or actors based on their skin color, but by the ability of their acting and storytelling. There's wider societal norm to accept new and POC characters to join these stories, which means that there's more actor roles from normalization, more connection being made within these industries, more recommendations of your fellow POC actors, and less systemic barriers that makes the industry much more fairer for the people of color. Therefore, negative.
Do you have a reply? Thank you. Now let's welcome up reply.
I want to firstly cast a doubt on the Affirmative case. Firstly, they talk about they are able to get the representation. I think that they try to characterize how this new story looks like is a general good thought. I think that if it's general, a no representation on hunger and struggle, not celebrating them, how can they get sense of representation? I think that in order to get the representation, it's necessary you have to include the historical background, necessary you have to include the hunger that they have. I think that they're doesn't able to claim that this is going to be like very general. If it's just like banal story, there's no unique experience, no unique representation, I don't think they're able to prove how the representation can be better off in their side of Thailand. Second thing they proved is about the pragmatic benefit, like they can get the salary, stuff like that. The first thing I want to say is that we can get more money because we have more attention. With more attention, it's necessary to have more viewership, probably there is more more view. I think that it leads to more money. So I think we are able to prove how we are able to get the pragmatic benefit as well. The second thing, more importantly, I think that Ryosei and Andrea already told you, we are able to set the better precedent on how the POC people doing well, not because of their race or skin color, they're able to get the credit for their activity. That's why I think that overall they are able to get the more betterment for these POC people or minority people on a pragmatic basis. Then, I think that we are able to suggest that simply weigh up the why attention is the most important, even if we don't have the super accurate depiction. I think the turn coming from us side is that because it is not new, they don't watch, but comparatively, they will people likely to watch POC story because it is new. I think this is very deep logic compared to what we already suggested, but I think there are several questions we want to cast. Firstly, why majority of people choose specifically POC story just because they want to start something new? Question, being new is not necessarily condition to get viewers in, there's a sense of nostalgia, algorithm drives people to be interested in. I think all of these mechanizations already talented designers coming from a family side, and we already proved to you how we are able to get the attention in our server better. Then we clearly show attention from majority publics far larger in our server. And I will unlock, even if you take the best case scenario coming from affirmative side, it's gonna be, probably the prediction is not always accurate. Because like without the crowd filming, I think that they weren't able to get the paces to create the representation, the pace to share our experience, the pace to fight against injustices. That's the reason why I think attention is very, very important. That's the reason why crowd following through the discussion, crowd following through the discussion is important. And I think this will be unlocked when we are able to get the attention. Even if it is misrepresentation, I think we are able to hop into the this falls on what is the actual representation we are. These are the things we prove throughout each speaker and not responded from authentic for the sake of the representation of minority negates.
With that Meg reply, now we'll move on to Ash reply. Thank you so much.
Three things. Firstly, what does this movie look like? Secondly, why the representation is going to be inaccurate. Lastly, is having attention in itself is a win for minorities, engaging and for nuance going to be negative. Firstly, what does this movie look like? I think like negative is highly uncharitable here. When they say that this movies are likely to be really pessimistic, no one's gonna care for it because like it's really tragic and like it's really, really angry, etc. I think this misses a lot of examples which my partner agrees to, right? I think this is factually untrue when we have like, a lot of examples where like these kind of, maybe like sad histories are included, but like, it's like depicted in a happy manner or like light manner, etc. I think we do explain why these kind of filmmakers have the capacity to do so. I think they don't really engage in this nuance. The second thing they say is that, like no one is gonna watch it because it's just for minorities. So the thing here is that we already explained to you as to why like these kind of minorities and moving these kind of minorities in and of itself, it creates like a huge profit because we can tap into them. Also like we can, I think like it is a blue ocean, etc. I think this is rather not engaged. And we also prove to you as to why if this like movie in and of itself is really good, I think why the majority of the people can also go watch it and why this is actually possible, right? So I do think like we do win in this case, but like then onto like explanation as to why representation is going to be inaccurate. Maybe they try to trade it off, but as long as like I think the first negative tries to have like the very best case, I'm going to like say touch on this. The gist of their logic is to say that like these producers are not like stupid, they have the incentive to cater to the minorities. But the first thing here is that we do explain why the incentive and the capacity is not something which is symmetric, and why this asymmetric elements are really, really important because it requires high level of incentive and capacity to depict these people in an accurate manner. The second thing is that because of their own logic, that is to say that we capture like the audiences throughout nostalgia, there is like not much like places that they can discuss on, and like there's not much resources that they will spend here, which I do think is unengaged. Also the biggest clash, which is about what is having attention in and of itself is a win for minorities. The problem I have with the negative side is that I'm not sure of what is the impact here. The first thing they say is that knowing about their culture is good because this is at the point in which representation actualizes. This is where I disagree, because I don't think like representation is like actualized. I'm not sure as to what actualized looks like, but like actualized when like some white guy knows about Japanese culture. But I think it actualizes more when like they interact with like minorities themselves. Just like someone saying I know that culture doesn't mean that like representation actualized. I think this is like the direct impacts are there when like they engage within like minorities, right? The second thing they say is that even if I do take their case, why are they going to be accepted as like a legitimate like representation is something that negative doesn't explain. Because my partners explained to you as to why these kind of accepting the representation is not likely to happen, but rather rejection is going to happen. Because like they tap into nostalgia, they think that this is something intuitive within. The way in which they try to impact their case is to say quote unquote discourse. But I don't know as to why discourse is something the majority is going to engage in, especially when like we take their best case scenario and say that these minorities are being accepted. This logically means that this taps into like the inaccurate of natural biases to them. They're not going to question. But I'm not sure as to why minorities are going to engage in these kind of like conversations in the first place, because they feel like less lenient, less like open to like discussions because they feel that they are powerless and they are being misunderstood.
We thank all debaters for a really wonderful round. and please cross room half handshake. So just wait for me about three more minutes. Thank you.
Thanks so much for this platform, and especially for POC. We kind of Asian graduates, and a lot of us feel quite kind of overwhelmed. Especially this has been quite kind of a lot of people that have been coming from this kind of professional language background, and we were kind of felt slightly kind of scary in this kind of tournament. Thank you so much for the platform to maybe allow us to try to prove ourselves to be worthy to some extent. Thank you so much. Okay, so slightly to net Ash. And that was all. So here are certain kind of comparisons. First is about accurate representation versus attention, and second is actually about what kind of the quality of the movie more likely to be reaching more people, and lastly about different stakeholders and what likely to get impacted negatively or positively. So we had first about representation. We had asked coming up with a lot of accurate representation slightly, because if you have those kind of old stories, nostalgia, but this is not actually right representation. Many of them, you're actually reinforcing a lot of pre-existing stereotypes, you're actually reinforcing the certain kind of negative image of those kind of minority people. That's why many of the policy and also a lot of the impacting of the critical change and critical mass are less likely to happen, because the reinforcing of the stereotype itself is likely to be probably less very badly very to the negative side of the minority people. That's why a lot of minority people feel betrayed, especially there are a lot of contextualized and also nuances, allowing us to have new stories being able to be created, especially to the advances of the latest context, and also about the authenticity itself is more likely to cater to the nuance, the demand, and also the real story and the real life, what is happening about minority people. A lot of these true stories are also likely to call attention and also be able to raise enough attention to some extent. That's why we have the most accurate representation, even if to some negative side that maybe more of these movies are likely to reach minority people slightly more, but given that majoritarian society will also have that attention and also incentive to try to be relate or empathize certain kind of minority people, especially majoritarian culture will also likely to tolerate to some extent of minority culture for respect and etc. That is why these movies are also likely to be able to reach certain kind of audience and enable to have more of an accurate representation. And that is certain kind of the negative side of the society more about accuracy, but also certain kind of attention and also relatability. Saturday was actually talking about a great deal of the times that people that are actually feeling this type of majoritarian society, you still are allowing them to be able to understand some kind of nuances about minority life and instances, especially cultural perspective and the particular sort of the context. You have to allow the majority people in order to understand, in order to relate, and also try to address those kind of structural issues. If they not be able to understand in the first instance, it is less likely for them to empathize, especially to the larger audience, to the international kind of level. Especially a lot of these movies are likely to be Disney movies that are likely to be distributed globally. That's why if you would be able to reach greater, larger audience, to be able to create greater relatability, more likely to have more attention and also discussion, more likely for more possibility for critical mass changes. So on these kind of factors, we find somehow that Saturday was speculative slightly about why a lot of the times that relatability is only about those kind of representation that is less likely to be to the authenticity side. More, I think that both sides agree to some extent that it's less likely to be student movies. It is less likely to be about those kind of scenes that are killing people, or about insanely bad these kind of minority people, or insanely unrealistic these kind of minority people. So both sides agree to some extent that this movie is convincing and also slightly more relatable to some larger extent of the minority life. But the only nuances is actually about why more of an aspect of authenticity likely to be more convincing, or less of an authenticity but more of a relatability to the majority, to the majoritarian experience. Therefore, the larger audience will be able to resonate, will be able to be convinced
okay, there are structural issues, then empathy are more likely to be happening. Slightly speculative about what kind of those kind of relatability aspects that is more likely to be understood or less likely to be understood. But I think that basically this kind of accurate representation and also to some extent about the comprehensibility of relatability of the majoritarian people most likely to be high if I'm not maybe to the negative of side net. Now we come to the second. I think that was the tipping point for the call. The first is actually about how side acts talk about attention, talk about the quality of the movies. I think that this is the side act will be able to prove that a lot of the nostalgia is actually quite kind of boring. That is why Disney movie uses theme about a trip of similar recasting. That is why even if you are addressing the certain kind of audience, but they are still likely to be the old cast, to be the old audience, who are still likely to be resonating on the same issue. That is why we needed new stories to be able to cater into the latest context. A lot of the time that this nostalgia is also negatively affecting the quality of the storyline itself. That is why a lot of the times you will need recognition from Oscar, this kind of accreditation from the institutionalized recognition. And all of this is depending upon the good quality of the movie itself. Why good stories and new stories are likely to resonate, improve certain kind of quality, is actually about new stories are more relatable to the real authenticity exposure. That is why people are less likely to be going to the movie if it's recast of similar movies in a similar storyline. That is why people, and especially audience, larger audience, are likely to be attracted to the movie that have new things and new casts. And certain kind of times that the majoritarian society will still be able to resonate to some extent and a degree about certain kind of minority stories. Therefore, empathy is still likely to be happening. So we would be able to have greater quality of the movie, less likely to be recasting of those kind of old movies. I think that to some extent that side will be able to mitigate some of the harm, but will not be able to tiptoe certain kind of inequality that is actually negatively impacting on the negative side. It is actually about a lot of the times that controversy are likely to be created, a lot of the times that the attention to the structural issue are likely to be created. But in itself, the quality of the storyline and a lot of the remaking and also the casting, the story itself probably is less likely to be slightly more speculative about quality as you likely to be happening, especially when the side act trying to put about you still need a box, you still need a larger viewership in order to make sure you have budgeting, in order to make sure you have this marketing. So you have greater marketing, you still be able to reach more audience. It is less likely to be only nuanced with this kind of minority audience or POC audience. It is still likely to be majoritarian audience. So to some extent, I think that said act will be able to prove slightly more of an extension of possibility for also wider potency of audience, even from the majoritarian side. That is why not necessarily as what next have talked about, only the minority audience are likely to be catered to certain kind of these movies, if not tending toward the majoritarian society. And also in terms of quality, I think that next Saturday were slightly kind of speculative, even if that we do agree to some extent international audience need to resonate some of the storyline. But we are not so sure that why these kind of old stories recasting again and again with the same kind of storyline and also with some old kind of characters that side act have said something, even if they are resonating, but a lot of these characters are still likely to be the older characters, so they are resonating to those older characters and also less likely to be crediting certain kind of the nuances that these new, the less likely to be credited even of these remaking characters. It's likely to be something like Disney, politically correct, a lot of movies. These are the major reasons that the quality is likely to be downgraded. We think that to a great degree, that the quality of the movie itself is very more important because there are multiplies about why Oscar recognition, why serious attention coming from the audience, exactly because it is credited institutionally by this kind of academia. Therefore, more likely people will also have certain kind of attention. So to some extent, that the attention point that is proven largely by SciNet will be able to be mitigated somehow from the app, that as long as the good quality movie are still likely to be pandered to and catered to by the majoritarian society, then there will be certain kind of quality movie still enjoying better marketing and also be able to reach larger audience. Therefore, a lot of the attention are still likely to retain on the side app. That is why the quality of the movie probably is the winning side. I think that to some extent there were pushback from the opposition side about why controversy itself is a good platform, because whenever you have controversies, which means that more platform are going to discuss about that, then a lot of the structural issues are still likely to be discussed, and also there are likelihood for people that are leading to, hey, these are the right traction to go, these are the right policy that we are needing, especially a lot of the issues and exposure of certain kind of actual concrete structural, that kind of injustice that has been more likely to be exposed in these movies. But it's less likely for the entire team to see that why a lot of the times where will be the direction of this discussion, because it is likely to be a lot of discussion in the meantime that there will be negative supporting, there will be positive support and also will be negative support to either of the side. Therefore, how that direction is like, the direction of the discussion is going to the negative, or the net negativity, or the net positivity probably is less likely, is slightly more speculative. That is why to some extent, that probably on that point about why controversies are also likely to be creating good impact to some extent, probably will need more discussion about why this kind of discussion is likely to the benefit or the net benefit of the minority people. That is likely missing. Then we come to the third kind of wash, or that kind of tie about stakeholders. I think that side of net have very good analysis about why POC writers and these minority directors are likely to be benefited, simply because that in these movies they got greater representation, more of an attention. Therefore, the livelihood and the monetary, financial kind of existential help coming from for supporting these POC cast and also these POC directors in order to empower them to some extent in their real life, even if it is very important. But in terms of propensity and skill, what kind of the impact that will be created by these POC writers and directors probably is so likely slightly more nebulous. We need more kind of analysis. And also in terms of the audience, that Side talk about, hey, we have a lot of audience to be able to get good movies, and also we will be able to free ourselves from this kind of old recasting. Therefore, new storylines are likely to attract people to these movies. Therefore, more of an exposure of some storyline that are still likely to create certain kind of catharsis. That is more often time that we say goodbye to old movies about traumatization of these minority people, being themselves in the audience of these movies to some extent. So we will be able to see that maybe to some extent that audience are better likely to be empowered, or to some extent that there are also possibilities that the audience will likely to be benefit to the quality movies, but there are other kind of stakeholders who are not so sure, even if that both sides are true, but which are more important stakeholders. There is a lack of weighing of who are the most important stakeholders by comparison of audience, larger propensity, and also about these POC people, and also these people that are actually are the target or are the key stakeholders that these minority movies want to